So hi everyone who has joined so far. My name is Emily Buckley and I'm just the NCHD lead for the SimStars project that's ongoing at the moment. I hope you all enjoyed the first workshop that we had. This is our second workshop today and we're lucky to have Dave Power of the ASSERT Centre joining us here today. So I know Dave, you'll probably introduce yourself there, but I know that you're the manager of the training and technology at the ASSERT Centre in UCC and have up to 10 years clinical experience or more, predominantly in ICU simulation with lots of simulation-based training thereafter. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here today, and very excited about the project. A lot of interest, and kind of blown away by the amount of people that have expressed interest in it. So many teams and everything. So delighted to be here, and hopefully you'll get something from this. So I suppose my own background, Emily said it, I'm an intensive care nurse by trade, cardiothoracics mainly, bit of neuro, bit of general. Spent about 10 years working in the London ICUs. Came back in 2007 and been working in simulation full-time since 2009 up in UCC. So this morning or this afternoon, going to have a little kind of a chat about a kind of a guide to putting a simulation scenario together. And then at the end of it, I'm going to maybe point towards some resources that, you can look at yourself. And then maybe next week, what I was thinking was that I'll take one of the scenarios that we have here, and then I might pick it apart and maybe use the template that John has put together and sent out to everyone, and maybe take the scenario that we have and kind of build it into that template, and then pick it apart and kind of rebuild it and look at it, if that kind of makes sense, and if that's useful to people. So maybe at the end, if there's questions and that kind of thing, if people think that's useful, then maybe that's what we could do next week. If people want to do something else, then maybe we could change that plan. I haven't done it as yet, so if someone wants, people want to do something else, that's fine too. So without further ado, anyway, we'll get stuck in. So the kind of steps in simulation design, and a lot of this will kind of come from ASFI and some of the other standards out there. And I'll point you to these resources at the end. So the first step is the needs analysis, and then it's doing the learning objectives. And I know some of this would have been covered by Catherine already. And then you're looking at your theory and your framework for your simulation, like the format of your simulation, and then the modality of your simulation. So that's really, you're looking at what type of simulator you're actually going to use. So, whether it's going to be a mannequin, or if it's going to be a role player, or, is it going to be a computer-based simulation or a video or whatever. And then you're looking at your valuation, and you should be thinking about that early on. So not an afterthought at the end. You should be thinking about that in the design process. And then you start thinking about how you're going to develop your simulation. And if it's multi-professional team training, I mean, that's best. I mean, if you can design that, and because you're working in the hospital, it's easier for you to do that than, I suppose, for us in the college, where a lot of ours are kind of undergrad training or postgrad training. It's a little more difficult for us, but when you're working in the clinical environment, you have really good opportunity to do this. So I mean, it's much more possible for you to do this. So I mean, that's where you get the most bang for buck, and the most benefits. So I'm sure that's how you're going to be designing yours. And once you have all these worked out, then you're going to start looking at the fidelity. Now there's little dashes beside some of these. So that's the format, the evaluation of fidelity. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about these because these are actually covered in other workshops, but I will talk about them a little bit and skim over them because they're important, but I'm not going to talk about them too much because they're in other workshops. And then it's onto your resource planning and your pre-brief planning. So that's kind of what you're going to talk to your participants before they come in, and what they expect from the day and from the simulation. So the very first thing is your needs assessment. So, I mean, this is really important. I mean, you need to kind of know why you're designing a simulation, and not just because you think it's a good idea, you know. And this could be formal or informal, you know, so we'll talk about that in a second. But, you know, your needs assessment, you know, you need to have evidence of why you want to create this simulation. And once you've done your needs assessment, it kind of gives you the overarching goal, like the main goal of what the simulation is going to be about. And then from that, then you're going to figure out what your learning objectives are going to be. So getting your needs assessment. So, you know, like I was saying, this could be formal or informal. Formal needs assessment is a kind of a long process, and you don't necessarily have to do that. But, you know, the different ways of getting a needs assessment, you know, the best way to design these things is to have it aligned to some curriculum or training program. You can do a SWOT analysis. You can look at root cause analysis, near misses, clinical incidents, you know, and working in the hospitals, you know, you have access to this type of information, you know, gap analysis, you know, performance analysis, other areas of clinical concern. You know, you can chat to other clinicians, educators, other stakeholders. You know, you can do a survey with these guys and find out what clinical concerns are, what the performance gaps are, and build your simulations around that. And obviously they should be linked into, you know, standards and protocols. So, you know, things like ACLS and, you know, difficult airway society, you know, things like that. So that, you know, they need to be linked to those kind of protocols and, you know, certifying bodies, that kind of thing. And all your local clinical policies as well should all be built into your needs assessment as well. You know, we often get these kind of data back from previous simulations as well. So we get information back from there as well. So we would ask, you know, previous participants, you know, what they'd like to see in other scenarios, what the gaps are, what they felt they didn't learn, or what scenarios they would like, and, you know, what's missing from the program. So we often do that as well. So, you know, the benefits of doing this are, you know, you can address the participants' needs and the clinical needs, the organizational needs as well. And by doing this as well, you know, you kind of uncover, you know, initiatives, organizational initiatives, quality improvement programs that you may or may not know existed, or new ones that might be, you know, coming down the pipeline, patient safety goals as well. And, you know, you can enhance the curriculum in the classroom and clinical areas as well by, you know, aligning this with a training program or with courses and so on. And, you know, obviously, you know, you've got the opportunities for standardizing clinical experiences, because everyone gets to do the same thing, you know, with simulation as well. So, you know, if you're putting everyone through the same experience, they all get to have a standardized clinical experience as well. And you can address, you know, the performance gaps and the clinical competencies as well. And, you know, there is the potential to improve clinical care and quality of care as well. So I suppose just to, you know, summarize it. So it's your needs assessment first, and that's when you get your overall goal for your simulation, and then you're onto your learning objectives. So once you have your learning objectives, you're going to need to be able to measure these as well. So your learning objectives are driven by your needs analysis, and these learning objectives, then they drive the design of the simulation. And you need to be very specific about what the learners are going to walk away with. And you need to know how the objectives, you need to know how they're going to be met and how you're going to measure them as well. So the goal of needs analysis and the learning objectives, they form the blueprint of the simulation design. And learning objectives, they should be smart. And we'll talk about that now in a second. and they need to be able to succeed as well. So when you're designing these, you need to make sure that you know, that the learners will be able to achieve them as well. So you need to keep in mind, you know, the level and the experience of the learners as well. So you need to keep all that in mind when you're designing these. So everyone's probably familiar with this, and I'm sure that Catherine has probably spoken about this already, and other taxonomies. You don't have to use this one, but there's other ones, and I'm just kind of showing it to you, but we'll just kind of skim over this. But you've Bloom's taxonomy here, and this can kind of help you when you're making your learning objectives. So at the bottom, you know, you're looking at the lower end, you know, where people just remember stuff and they're able to list, you know, list things. And this is an example there, you know, can they list the most common causes of a DVT or PE? And then you're looking at the higher end where they are able to create new knowledge and apply that. So, you know, an example there is, you know, based on your past experience, can you formulate an approach to manage this case and justify your treatment plan? So that's, you know, the opposite end. So when you're planning out your learning objectives, you need to kind of think, you know, where your learners are at and what experience they have, and, you know, can they achieve this? So it all depends on what level they're at. So, you know, all these kind of taxonomies and frameworks will help you design your learning objectives. So then you're onto your SMART learning objectives. And really, all it is who will do what and how much of what and by when. And when you break it all down, they need to be specific. So what action will be performed by who? They need to be measurable. So you need to be able to measure it or observe it. And they need to be obtainable. So they need to be able to achieve it as well. So like we're saying, it needs to be kind of at their level as well. So they need to be able to, you know, they need to be able to achieve this. It needs to be relevant to either the learner, or relevant to the clinical environment, or relevant to the organization. And needs to be time-based as well. So, or time-bound. Sometimes see time-bound written instead of time-based. So, you know, the simulation can't run on forever. So, you know, you need to, you know, it needs to be achievable in the time of the allocated for the simulation as well. This is another taxonomy. So if you're looking at, you know, clinical skills, and this is really for clinical skills and procedural skills, and there's loads of these. There's loads of them out there, but this one example, and this is probably the easiest one to implement. And imitation is kind of copying someone. So, you know, they watch what you're doing, and then they're able to copy and imitate what you've done, through to precision, where they're able to do a lot of the task with, you know, some expertise, and just making a couple of errors, up to naturalization, where they can do the skill almost intuitively and automatically. And this is more for kind of, you know, psychomotor skills. So if you're maybe designing something that's a clinical skill or a procedure, you might want to look at something like Dave's psychomotor taxonomy. There's other ones as well. There's Harrow's, and there's Simpson, and I can't remember the others, but there's a lot out there. But there are at least 3 anyway that you could look at: Dave's and Harrow's and Simpson's. But Dave's is probably the easiest and most simple one anyway. And then always bear in mind that you're dealing with adult learners, and, you know, they learn best when, you know, they need to know why they're learning something, and, you know, they're always self-motivated once they know why they need to learn something. And it's always, you know, it should be centered around their work as well. They learn best when they're problem solving as well, and it's relevant and immediate use, and that's kind of related, you know, back to their job. I mean, if they can, you know, if they can relate it back to what they're actually doing, and they can use it every day, you know, they'll engage with it, and they learn through experience. And once that experience is kind of relating to previous experiences, you know, that's how adult learners learn best. and this is important kind of important thing to consider when you're building your learning objectives, is cognitive load. And we've always kind of known this in simulation. Certainly I've often, you know, thought about this from when I started working in simulation, but it's only really starting to see it really in the literature probably in the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, and it's starting to get a lot more attention, is that, you know, like working memory has a limited capacity. We've always known this, and the duration of our working capacity and duration. And if you give people too many tasks, then, you know, you'll surpass their working memory, and learning's impaired. They've always known that, but people haven't really, you know, talked about it too much in simulation until probably around 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And emotions, anxiety levels are raised in simulation. We know this, and this increases cognitive load as well. So we need to be careful when we're designing our scenarios, that you're not making them too stressful, and two, you're not giving them too many learning objectives, because you just push them over the edge. They'll be like a deer in the headlights when you send them in. There'll just be too much going on. So there's a few things we can do to reduce this, and we've always kind of done it here anyway. But there's a few things that you can consider to reduce that, so people perform at their best, and you want people to do well. So the things that we can do is you have a decent pre-brief in the morning, and often this doesn't get enough attention at all, and it's really important. And I spend, like, if we have a full day simulation, I can spend nearly 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, with the guys in the morning for a full day simulation, explaining everything to them, and so they know what's going on, and orientating them to the environment and to the simulator. And there's a few reasons for that, because when they go into the simulator, they don't want to be poking around looking for pulses and that kind of thing in the middle of a simulation, or not knowing what the simulator can and can't do, and they don't know what to expect, because, you know, all that should be loaded up front. They know all this stuff before they go in, and then they can perform at their best. So the pre-brief is really important, and there should be sufficient time for that. So you want to orientate them properly before they go in, and they know their environment, and they know where everything is, and they know how everything works before they go in. And the whole process is explained to them, and all the expectations of the day or the simulation is explained to them up front. And it's all about establishing trust and respect and integrity and all that kind of stuff. But you want to relax people into it as well, and try and make it as fun as possible, you know. And I know there's a serious message to the whole thing, but, you know, it doesn't have to be all that's, you know, serious when you're talking to people in the morning. You know, you want to kind of relax people into it. So, you know, so they're going to perform well when they go into the simulations. So the other thing as well is reducing redundant sources of information. And how we can do that is if, say, someone's gone into a team-based scenario where, you know, they're going into either a standardized patient, or they're going into, you know, mannequin-based simulation, and you give them a script before they go in, and then they get a handover, and then they have to look at lots of charts, and then they have to go through medical notes, and they're getting the same information over and over again. It's just overload for them. So, you know, you just need to think about how you're going to give them that information, and just give them the information that they need, and just give it to them once, you know. So, you know, to all these things we need to think about. So we're just reducing that cognitive load before they go in. And then you just want to progressively escalate the scenarios. You're not throwing them straight into a dire emergency as well. That there's, you know, there's at least a few minutes for them to, you know, settle into it and get their bearings as well. And then gradually escalate the difficulty of the task and the learning objectives as well. And I was saying, just, you know, you want to really think about the number and the complexity of the learning objectives as well. And, you know, can some of the learning objectives be discussed in the debrief? Not everything has to be in the simulation as well. And some of them are more appropriate for the debrief anyway. So you just need to think about all that. So you can't fit everything into the simulation. So the other things, and I'm not going to talk about this too much because I think that this was probably discussed already, but you know, if you're looking at clinical skills, then or procedural skills, then, you know, you might want to think about deliberate practice or something like that, and how you're going to, you know, what framework we're going to use. And mastery learning is probably, you know, the one that's been looked at the most, you know, and probably shows, you know, probably some of the best results. And I think a lot of what I've seen anyway is that what you're developing is supposed to be multidisciplinary, so you're probably going to be looking at interprofessional learning, and I have a resource to point you towards that you can look at the end. It's a kind of a framework or a standard for it. Now it's come out from nursing, but it is interprofessional learning. There isn't a whole lot in it, but it's got some references that point you elsewhere as well. So it's probably worth looking at that and maybe having a read around that, and might help you when you're designing your simulation to have a little read around that. And also, you know, when you're building your simulation as well, you're going to want to put in some human factors or crisis resource management, and sometimes you'll see these terms, you know, interchangeable as well, you know, into it as well. So, you know, you're going to want to think about, you know, calling for help, but, you know, not just calling for help, you know, calling for help, you know, at a point where, you know, it's actually going to make a difference and that kind of thing, you know, and not just ticking a box, you know, that they call for help, you know, and looking at leadership skills, and looking at, you know, do they know what's going on? So, you know, situational awareness, so they actually know what's happening in the scenario, but they're communicating that to their team, so everyone knows what's going on, that type of thing. So these are the type of things that, you know, you're going to want to build into your scenario as well. There's quite a lot to read about, and quite a lot to look at with this type of stuff. And I have a resource at the end that possibly you might want to look at. It's from Anglia University, I think. Now it's 9 hours long, so I'm not sure you want to look at the whole thing, but I'll point you somewhere else anyway that you know, isn't quite as long as well. But I haven't looked at that one myself, but, you know, I was wondering if someone did eventually look at it, they might feed back to me and tell me, was it any good? But it's 9 hours long. It's probably a fairly comprehensive introduction to it anyway. But, you know, these are the things that you might want to start thinking about building into your learning objectives as well. So once you have these kind of things thought about, then you're going to be onto your modality of simulation. And it's not fidelity or fidelity of the simulator. And this is a concept that was around for a long time in simulation, was the high fidelity simulator, low fidelity simulator. And a lot of that was kind of driven by the companies. So it's the platform of the simulator. So, you know, the mannequin, if you're using a mannequin, it's the functionality. What functionality do you need to deliver your simulation? And this is all driven by your learning objectives. So, you know, at one end, you might need a BLS mannequin to do it. At the other end, you might need, you know, a machine that will ventilate, an ICU with an ICU ventilator, and that's the higher end functionality. So you know, and then you've got mannequins all in between. Standardized patients, so maybe if you're doing communication based training, you might look at role players or standardized patients. And task trainers then are all your procedural skills and your skills trainers. And hybrid simulators, that can be a mixture of anything really, but it's often a role player or a standardized patient with possibly, you know, some kind of, it could be an example, could be using, you know, like an arm that you can inject drugs into or something like that. Is often what a hybrid simulation might be. It could be a mixture of a task trainer and a standardized patient, or a task trainer and a mannequin, that kind of thing. And then you follow your computer-based simulation as well, VR or your AR or just your PC style stuff. And video-based simulation, we do a little bit of this. It's the St. Emily there that we did one yesterday, and this is where we've shot videos of simulations, but we've shot them ourselves where everyone's a role player, but we're all simulation staff, and we've staged the whole thing, and then we've stopped the video at certain points, and then we break into groups and discuss what's going on, and we bring all the groups back together. We'd show another portion of video, and we might do this 3 or 4 times for every scenario, and then each of the smaller groups would feed back to the bigger groups, and it actually worked really well. We did one yesterday with ICU staff, and it actually worked really well. We did another one next week, and it went surprisingly well, actually. So it's something we probably will do a little bit more of, actually. And the other thing is that you should try and incorporate the patient perspective where appropriate and if possible. And that's actually one of the standards that, will come out from ASSERT as well, and SESAM and all these simulation societies. And that can just be as much as, doing the patient voice and all that kind of stuff as well. So, try and get the patient perspective in there as best you can as well, so the patient's not forgotten. Okay, so as I was saying earlier, you want to plan for your evaluation early, and it shouldn't really be an afterthought. So, I mean, this is a familiar evaluation kind of framework as well, and it's the Kirkpatrick one that, a lot of people have seen this. It's often, I suppose, not used the best way it can be used. It really should be used kind of backwards, where the triangle is actually upside down like this. So, what you're really doing is you're trying to figure out what the results are going to be, and work with it that way. So you're really thinking, what's the business or the clinical result can I get from this, and then work your way back to, how are my participants reacting to the simulation or the training that I've done. And you guys are in a much better position to be able to get a much higher level of evaluation like this than we can, because I suppose you can review critical incidents before and after interventions and that kind of thing, which is much more difficult for us to do at UCC. So so something to think about as well, that you have a much better chance of being able to measure this than we can. So just think about it as well when you're designing your scenario, how you're going to measure this as well, and kind of think results first and then reaction last, or even if it's behavior, but try and go as high up the triangle as you can. So then you're on to your scenario development, and and this, I suppose, is kind of built around, I suppose the simulation scenario is in the kind of, I suppose, more the team-based ones really, and more the kind of mannequin-based or maybe the simulated patient-based kind of scenarios might not be as relevant to people that are just looking at clinical skills, but hopefully it'll be, some way helpful anyway. But first going to be kind of looking at your situation and the background, and you're going to be looking at a realistic starting point and including the history as well. So I mean, you're kind of providing a context and context for the situation here, and then it's the progression from that point. So you're looking at advancing the case, and that's all linked to actions of what people are going to do in the scenario, the actions of your participants. When we're talking about cues, the cues are kind of linked to the performance measures, and they're kind of used to refocus people if they stray from what they're supposed to be doing. So if they start doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, or they're not picking up on certain things, or it's just to kind of pique their attention to something as well. So I don't know, if you had anaphylaxis or something like that, you might be kind of saying, that you've got angioedema, or your tongue is swelling up, or you feel itchy. Those kind of things, they're all the kind of things that we'd consider cues as well, that, you know, you're building all those into your scenario, and at what point you're going to put them in. Your time frames then, or, you know, the reasonable time is designed into achieving your objectives. And the script is very important, and this needs to be consistent and standardized, and so there's no variation. So everyone who comes into the simulation has the same learning objectives, and they all get the same experience, and they all have the same learning objectives as well, and they all meet. They might not meet the learning objectives, but they all have the same opportunity to. So the critical actions, that's evaluating the achievement of the simulation objectives. So how you kind of start this then, it's just like a story. So, you know, it's someone arrives in A&E or wherever they arrive, however they got there, you designing the script yourself, and it's listing all the steps that need to be taken to achieve the objectives, and it's listing out all of those steps. And are all those steps measurable? Are they all observable? And then the end point of the scenario. So it's every step from the start to the end. So this example there, be hand over to I see you, and I say next week I'll actually put a worked example, and I'll build it into the SimStars template. And the end point obviously is when, you know, they've met the objectives or the skills or the behaviors, and obviously it could be when time runs out. If they don't meet them, you know, that's you know, something to talk about in the debrief, because you know, it can't run on forever either. So and it just becomes stressful as well for the people in there. You know, obviously you can, you know, give as many cues as you want, and you know, it's really good practice to have a plant in the room. I think, you know, Confederates is another word. It's kind of starting to creep in a little bit from the US. We used to call them plants in the UK anyway, which would be a member of the simulation team that'll be in the room, role playing as a nurse or a doctor or some other health professional, or it could be a relative. Normally, it's better to have them as one of the healthcare professionals, and they keep the scenario on course, and they don't normally step out of the role of whatever role they're in. They know the role inside out. They know the scenario inside out, and they'll keep trying to steer the scenario in the direction it's supposed to be going. But obviously, if you're not getting to where you need to go, then time could run out at some point. So you just need to bear that in mind as well. So you'll be developing a process map as well. So there are decision points, yes or no, of your observable skills or behaviors. And it's really just working out, if someone does A, X is going to happen. If someone does B, Y is going to happen. But, you know, you need to plan, if they do C, D, or E, what's going to happen, because people can do all kinds of things, and you need to kind of plan for that as well. And you'd be surprised what people will do. And you could make the scenario as obvious as you think. And it happened to me in the early days of programming simulators to do lots of different things. And you'll be really surprised that people just sometimes won't pick up on what it's supposed to be, no matter what cues are. So you just need to bear all that in mind and plan for it, and have a plan, a couple of different plans up your sleeve. And if they don't do anything, you're going to need to plan for that as well. And like I was saying there, you need to have a plant in the room as well. So I mean, it keeps control on the situation as well. So when we're talking about fidelity, then, and it's kind of concerned with like how real the situation is going to be, and you know, it does make a difference to achieving the learning objective. So, you know, it needs careful consideration, really. So, and there's three, you know, it's kind of debatable on you know, there's different kind of models. You know, this is the current kind of thing in the moment is three different fidelities: physical fidelity, conceptual fidelity, and psychological fidelity. So the physical fidelity, you're kind of looking at, you know, how realistic does it replicate the physical environment? So that's your simulators, your standardized patients, your props, the actual environment itself. So this all needs thinking about where you're going to run your simulation, the equipment you're going to have, that kind of thing. And the conceptual fidelity, you know, do all the things relate to each other in a meaningful way. So really you're looking at your observations, your vital signs. Are you using a vital signs monitor? You know, if you are, you know, does that relate to what's on the observation chart? Does it relate to, you know, what's happening to the patient? And is it the past medical history? You know, is that consistent with the case? All this type of stuff, you know. It does seem obvious, but it does need thinking about. The psychological fidelity is probably the most important one, and that's how much people are actually going to believe that the situation is real, or some way real, and buy into it. So, you know, that's how much, you know, everything ties in together, really. So the things you need to think about here, you know, these are all the little things that you can add to add fidelity to it. So, you know, if you're using a mannequin, you know, and, you know, like even the high-end mannequins, they can talk, but, you know, the voice that comes out of them is just a tiny speaker inside a rubber head, and the noise is atrocious, like, you know, so we don't even use that, like, so we use like a PA system almost, you know, where we do a voice from with a speaker under the bed, and we use a microphone. So, I mean, I was suggesting something like that, you know, and the sound is much louder and much more realistic, because the system that comes with even the really expensive ones aren't good on any of them. So you know, that's what I'm talking about, like doing an active voice for the patient rather than maybe someone standing at the end of the bed, or, you know, trying to do the voice for the patient. It just adds that a little bit more, you know, realistic conversation, that kind of thing. Adding in distractions, noise, family members, time pressure, those kind of things, competing priorities, all add that level of kind of psychological fidelity where people kind of believe that the situation might be real. And then using clinical equipment. So, I mean, again, you know, you're at a huge advantage there, you know, working in hospitals where, you know, you're using the equipment that people, you know, use every day. It is the real equipment. It's what people are used to, you know. So, you know, use what you can. And if you can't use the real equipment, and you have to use maybe older versions of the equipment from the equipment library that maybe hasn't been used for a few years, just explain it in the debrief if they're not used to it, and why are you using it, and the differences in the equipment so they're used to it before they go in. And we have to do that here. I mean, some of the equipment we have here is a little older, you know, and we spend a bit of time showing people how to use it. You know, and not everything has to be perfect, and not everything has to be, you know, perfectly real. You don't have to get to that level, you know. I mean, sticking on fake wounds and onto a mannequin or onto a patient, like a standardized patient, and putting a bit of blood on a sheet and having a multi-parameter monitor with a tachycardia and a low blood pressure is enough for someone to believe that their patient is bleeding and having a significant bleed. And you can get free software. I think one I can think of, you can just download off the internet. I think it's called VSS, and you can drive that from a laptop with 2 different monitors, and you can drive any observations on it, and that's free. You know, so all these things can be done with pretty low end mannequins, and it looks real enough. So the other things you might want to, you know, think about is, you know, build your case off a real case. You know, a clinical incident. You know, you can use all the DX-rays, and you know, you might want to use, you know, the results and that kind of stuff. Obviously, you're going to have to, you know, take all the patient's details off them and that kind of thing. But it might be an easy way to start anyway, building a case, and just link it into, you know, your patient safety and local policies and initiatives. You know, you'll want to design in your technical, your non-technical learning objectives as well. Another important thing to think about when you're scheduling your event, you're thinking about it, and this will come into the design, you know, is it a scheduled event where people are going to kind of, you know, it's going to run and people have time booked off to go to it? Is it going to be in a booked room somewhere? Is it going to be in situ? So, you know, is it going to happen on the unit? Or is it going to be an impromptu simulation, and all of these have their own benefits and disadvantages. You know, obviously if it's a scheduled event, people have time booked off, you know, and they can go to it, but often it's going to be in a room that probably is going to have low fidelity, you know, because it's probably going to be some kind of tutorial room or something. An in situ simulation, an impromptu simulation is, you know, are probably more realistic, you know, environmentally, you know, they're probably, the fidelity is probably higher, but you've got the challenge then that, you know, they could get cancelled because, you know, with competing, you know, with, you know, competing against patient care and that kind of thing, if the units are busy. But, you know, you've got the benefits then that you're getting to test local policies and procedures and that kind of thing on the unit. You know, they can kind of expose like latent errors and that kind of thing that might be in the system that you might never know existed if you never ran the simulations there. So, you know, there's huge benefits to running these simulations on the units and in the clinical environment. They can kind of expose weaknesses in the system. So, you know, it's really worth thinking about how you're going to run these simulations, where they're going to run and how you're going to do them. And it's definitely worth thinking about, spending a bit of time how these are going to run. You know, figuring out how you're going to do this and how you're going to get around the challenges of you know, if there is challenges, how you're going to get around it. So, you know, you're going to think about what resources you need and plan all this out, what simulation equipment you're going to need, or, you know, you're going to need standardized patients. But, you know, standardized patients can be staff, you know, you don't have to be trained actors or anything like that, you know. Clinical staff will know how to behave like a patient. So, you know, and you're going to, you know, if you've got the resources available to you and people willing to do it, you can use staff as your standardized patients, your role players. You know, think about your props, your clinical equipment and all the paperwork that you need and all this stuff, you know, seems obvious, but, you know, it does take planning and it does take time as well. I think you want to plan out your pre-brief as well and spend sufficient time on that. You know, if it's only one simulation, obviously you're not going to spend an hour talking about it. But, you know, I suppose a good rule would be if you're running one simulation that's 20 minutes long, then, you know, I would give 10 or 15 minutes, you know, to the pre-brief, 20 minutes to the simulation and half an hour to the debrief, you know, something along those lines. And, you know, if you're running multiple simulations, then you'll probably want to give a longer pre-brief as well, you know. And then obviously, you know, if when you're building your scenario as well, you're going to want to run it past the subject matter expert. I mean, when we were building the course we did yesterday, you know, it was designed in-house with also one of the lecturers in the School of Nursing, but we sent it out to six clinical facilitators in the ICUs, and we sent it out then after that, once we got their feedback, to anaesthetists that work in ICU, you know, even though it was just for, you know, it was for nurses only, but we still I wanted to get the input from medical people to just get their perspective and see what they thought of it as well. You know, so that's kind of how we did it. And then the simulation standards, there's a few of them around. ASFI is probably the best one that I would recommend to look at. When you click on their website, I think this one brings you actually to the standards, because I think when you go onto the website, it has all kinds of different links to the standards, how they came up with the standards, all kinds of stuff. But I think this actual link will bring you directly to the standards. I think it does. But the standards are good, and it actually tells you how they developed the standards as well, and the decisions of how they came to the standards, which you know, which you don't get with a lot of other standards. The other one underneath is, the name escapes me slightly, I think it's the International Nursing Association of Clinical and something Simulation, but they've got a good few different standards in there, and they've got stuff in there on, you know, interprofessional learning. They've got stuff in there on all kinds of stuff. And there's a good few different standards in there, and they're all simulation based. The standards themselves are a little bit on the light side, but each one is separate. You know, there'll be a separate one for there's a separate one for interprofessional learning. There'll be a separate one for debriefing. There's a separate one on something else. But there's a lot of references in the back of it and that kind of stuff, and it can then point you on somewhere else. The one underneath it is, I think, the Association of Standardized Patient Education, I think. And that's all about using standardized patients and all that kind of stuff, if we're interested in that. The one under there, the human factors one, is that course I was telling you about. It's free. It's from the University of East Anglia. It's, I think, 9 hours long, but you probably get through it faster than that. I don't know if people, I wouldn't suggest anyone do it right now, because I don't think you've got time, to be honest with you. Might be something someone might want to tip away at in the background. In the meantime, if people were interested and they wanted to look up that kind of stuff, you know, the Clinical Human Factors Group, and I think their website is chfg.org, is a good resource, you know, to look up that kind of stuff. But I just thought I'd put that course up there, and, you know, if someone did it, I'd like to get their feedback and see if it was any good, actually. It's only 9 hours long, and I think it's free. And I think if you'd want a cert, I think you have to pay. But it'd be interesting to see what that course is like. So that's kind of it from me for now. But I think next week I would I'll take a scenario, and what I'll do is I'll pull it apart and I'll build it into the template that John sent around, and have a look at it in detail and kind of dissect it a little bit, and we'll put it up and we'll pull it apart line by line and look at all the different parts of it, and what goes where, and what should go where, and why it goes where, and that kind of thing. If that's useful. If people don't think that's useful, then possibly we could do something else. So okay, thanks for listening anyway. And if anyone has any questions or anything, just fire away there.
Thanks very much, Dave. I actually think that was really, really helpful and really insightful. Even just like, I've ran 1 or 2 simulation scenarios myself, but I hadn't even really thought about things like the concept of plants and confederates, and even the concept of psychological fidelity. It's, you know, just the little things like that could really make a difference, I think. Even just things like having the radio on. I suppose just for myself, we get a lot of questions, even just from the group we have at the moment that I've entered, about timing, and kind of concerned about how long each scenario should be. And I suppose it really probably depends on the given scenario, but would you have any advice about that, or maybe how to decide on that?
Sorry, now I wasn't sure now, was my thing open or not. I think for the team-based ones, what we normally do, and I haven't seen the scenario, so I'm trying to guess, I suppose, of what's come in, and I'm just kind of guessing on the email that went round. That are they kind of team-based scenarios that have gone out, or that have come back in? I mean,
yeah. So we've encouraged everyone to enter something that is team-based, that would involve basically the multidisciplinary team, so at least 1 doctor and 1 other healthcare discipline.
Generally, we don't run ours over 20 minutes. So we run ours about 20 minutes, and then we talk about it for about half an hour afterwards.
Okay.
So that's kind of generally what we do. It would be very unusual for our scenarios to run over 20 minutes. And they're often about 15 minutes long, 15, 20 minutes long.
Okay. And just regarding the whole kind of concept of cognitive load, and I think that is really important, and I think we've all probably been in scenarios when we've been the learners of kind of trying to remember what you have to do, being aware that you're being watched, and kind of how to do it competently. And I know you kind of said to be careful in terms of how you give your information at the start. Do you mean kind of say verbally or in the form of handouts, or have you any examples of how we should give the information?
I don't know if it matters, you know, which way you do it, but I think it's just been. I think you need to think which way you're going to do it, and not have multiple, giving the same information over and over and over again. You know, and I think, you know, even maybe at the very start when we did this, we were trying to make loads of notes to make it look as realistic as possible. You know, but all you're really doing is you have someone going through loads of notes. They've already got the handover. So I think it's what's relevant to just managing the case. So often, you know, we'll just give someone a very brief handover, what they need to know to manage the case. There might be an observation chart, there might be notes, there might just be 2 sides of 1 page, you know, and you know, it's just the critical information of what they need to know to manage the case. You know, because and what we've done as well is, you know, you can tell looking at somebody if they're getting stressed, if they're getting, you know, worked up, and then we'll actually start dialing back the scenario a little bit. You know, and it's just being able to adjust the scenario to people as well, because if they're not going to reach any of the learning objectives, you might as well try and reach some of them. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, yeah, and you know, there's no point putting people under that kind of pressure. So we'll dial it back, and we often do that. But you know, it doesn't have, you know, they're normally kind of set at a level that they should be able to reach. But you will get the odd situation where someone just won't, you know, and we'll dial it back then, you know, because you don't want someone going out feeling bad, you know. You want them going.
Yeah, and I suppose even the concept of being able to dial it back, and when we're planning it, is important itself. Do you know how you would do that or go about doing that? I'll just ask, does anyone else have any other questions from those participating today? I think Prof Cook has a question here.
Hi Dave, how are you?
Hi John.
I'm not sure if you can see me. Great to hear.
I
What for that. I thought that was a fab presentation today. You covered a massive amount of ground. I mean, I wonder, you know, what I kind of struggle to understand now, having seen the level of detail that you consider when you're designing a case. I mean, I'm sure when you're as expert at it as you are, you don't necessarily include all of this detail in the document.
No.
You know, but that's when you're working in an expert center, where people kind of, to a certain extent, presume that the people around them are kind of experienced simulators. I suppose the advice for us might be, when we're at a more novice level, to actually address each of these points individually within the document, so that I mean, it obviously makes the document a bit lengthy then, but is that the best way to go about it, or what would you suggest?
That's what I was thinking. Maybe next week I would. That's what I thought it might be useful to maybe use, you know, the document that you had sent around, and I could take one of our scenarios and I could build it into that, and you know, possibly pick it apart a little bit and how we would do it. But and it would address some of that. And you're right, yeah. I mean, if you look at some of it, they'd say, you know, the learning objectives would have to have this and the reason why and so on. But you know, in the actual in the actual simulation document that people are going to be using day to day, that's too long a document. You know, I mean, people need to be able to pick it up, know what's going on, know, you know, share it around, and yeah, of course, it's going to be shorthanded a little bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then I suppose I'm also conscious that it's a competition too, so people have to demonstrate that they've at least considered all of these various aspects that you've kind of done. So it's about trying to find that middle ground whereby the document is accessible but yet sufficiently detailed. So it will be, I think your suggestion of taking a worked scenario and applying it to the pro forma, as we've kind of agreed for the competition, is I think it's a really good idea anyway. Yeah.
Okay, and is there any other questions from the group? Okay, if not, we might wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Dave, for
No
that today. It was
problem.
great. And definitely looking forward to the talk again next week to take part a scenario and kind of put it all into play. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for putting up with me for the last hour.